All right, my name is Chris Campbell. I'm a practicing CPA, and I work with small businesses and individuals to help them pay the least amount of taxes possible while keeping them out of jail. Today, I wanted to talk about the 1031 exchange and a little bit of a nuance here. This was something that I was doing some research on and found something pretty interesting that I figured I'd share. Most folks that talk about the 1031 exchanges, this is for mostly our real estate investors here that get involved with the 1031 exchange. To give a brief recap, with the 1031 exchange, basically for real estate investors, it allows you to trade or exchange one piece of real estate for another without paying capital gains tax. I shouldn't say without actually paying the capital gains tax. You defer the capital gains tax. Brief example, let's say you buy a piece of property for $100,000, it appreciates to $200,000, and you exchange it for a $200,000 property. You sell the first property and get into the other property for $200,000. The $100,000 you made in appreciation, you get to defer the taxes on that. That's how a 1031 exchange works. For those familiar with that, there are strict timing guidelines in order for this to work and for it to be a completely tax-free transaction. When you sell that first property, you have to identify the next property within 45 days, and then you have to execute and find that next property within 180 days. It's roughly 6 months from selling that first property. You have to be into the next property within 180 days, and you have to identify that property within 45 days of selling the first property. When you do a 1031 exchange, you can't touch the money. You can't do a 1031 exchange by selling a property and then taking the proceeds and buying. You can't physically touch the money. You have qualified intermediaries or QIs, and they hold the money. Between the sale and the purchase of the next property, in order to have a successful 1031, you need a QI so that you don't touch the money. The minute you touch the money, a 1031 exchange is null and void. There are third parties out there that help execute these 1031 exchanges. The twist here is, I was doing some research and I asked, what if you did it in reverse, where you bought that next property and then sold the property you had after you purchased the next property? I was researching to see if that was possible, if you could still execute a 1031 exchange doing it in that order, and come to find out you can. It's called a reverse 1031 exchange, where you buy the next property first, sell your initial property second. It is feasible to get the same tax treatment as a regular 1031 exchange. You are subject to the same restriction. You have to buy that next property within 180 days. You have to sell your first property within 180 days of buying the initial one. You buy the next property, then you have to sell the property you have. As long as you do that within the 180 days of buying that first, you can execute a 1031 exchange. The thing here where the QIs come in, your qualified intermediary, is that you can't own both properties at the same time. How do you get around doing that? You use your qualified intermediary. They'll set up a company, a holding company, to temporarily hold that property while you go through the process of selling that initial property. Some sort of LLC gets set up to hold that property. When you purchase that property, it's the QI, that intermediary, that's going to purchase that property through an LLC. You're the owner, but it's through an LLC. You can't have it in your name, otherwise the transaction is disqualified. They'll get the property in the LLC, and once you sell your first property, then that LLC gets dissolved, or that property then gets relinquished to you and your name to fully execute that 1031. You can't leave it in the LLC, because that's two different parties. Ultimately, the property needs to wind up in your name, because if the initial property that you had was in your name, then in order for the transaction to hold up, everything needs to be in your name. You can't buy one property under the LLC and then sell the other property under your name. Everything needs to be under your name. Once you sell that initial property, the property you purchased can get transferred to your name. I've seen scenarios like this and figured it could be a scenario. From looking at it, maybe more people should actually do it that way, because I've seen situations where you look to sell the property and most folks doing a 1031 exchange may have a hard time finding the next property to replace it, versus if you find the property first that you want to replace it with, it may be easier to get a seller on your property. You're less under the gun versus doing it the other way, where you have to hurry up and buy something to make sure the 1031 is good, and you may wind up buying something you may not care for. It might not be the perfect deal, but you're buying something just to execute the 1031 and avoid taxes. This is food for thought and not commonly widespread, so hopefully this was helpful to many real estate investors. Think about doing it the other way, something for your real estate investors to consider. You may want to envision doing a 1031 the opposite way versus how it's traditionally discussed. If you have any more questions about this topic or any other tax or accounting questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to help. That's all for now.